Okay, comrades, we are back reading the next part of Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend, a book written by Domenico Lacerdo, translated by comrades at Iskra Books. We're on chapter 7, The Image of Stalin Between History and Mythology. The various historical sources of today's image of Stalin. And, nevertheless, today's historiography finds it difficult to distance itself from the image of Stalin as a huge, grim, whimsical, morbid human monster who, moreover, is so lacking in intellectual and political capacity as to be laughable. Even for a myth, there needs to be a search for historical origins. It is appropriate to start from the scholar, Dutcher, to whom I have just referred, who in another circumstance, and in a different period of time, observed, quote, unlike the Jacobins, the Bolsheviks did not execute their Grindinets. That is, the Mensheviks, who were authorized and even encouraged to leave Russia and establish a political center abroad. From here, there developed a strong campaign against the country that had been first headed by Lenin and then, for a much longer period of time, by Stalin. Dutcher thus continued, quote, it is certain that Stalin did ponder over the horrifying French precedent, and that for some years this deterred him from resorting to the most drastic means of repression. Stalin expressed himself thus more than once. In 1929, he made up his mind to exile Trotsky from Russia. It was still inconceivable that Trotsky should be imprisoned, let alone put before a firing squad. Unquote. With the arrival of the leader of the opposition in Istanbul, a new and more committed political center had formed, this time dedicated exclusively to the unmasking and denunciation of every aspect of Stalin's personality and activity. In this same context, one can place defectors like General Orlov, who, having landed in the West, devoted himself to the revelations of the secrets of the Kremlin, earning an enormous honorum, and presumably an honorum all the greater the more sensational the secrets brought to light. Eagerly accepted in the Soviet Union itself from the Gorbachev period onwards, and still today one of the most important sources of Western Sovietology. These revelations are nevertheless studied with lies. And as you can see here, a strategy that comes up that is used today, in fact, in DPRK, in order with the defector testimony. The same thing you see being used way back then in Lenin and Stalin's time, and then even more exhilarated even more with Khrushchev and his perestroika. This guy's like Yeonmi Park, chat says. Exactly. To continue, obviously, one must not lose sight of the fact that the center of anti-Stalinist agitation is precisely in the West. Its motives had been made clear in advance by Lord George, who had observed in the summer of 1919 that a united Russia, Bolshevik or not, constituted a source of danger to the British Empire regardless. That is, a wide range of public opinion, first British and then American, branded in Stalin the embodiment of a twofold threat that represented by communist agitation in the capitalist metropolis and especially in the colonies, and that represented by a great power, now all the more dangerous and all the more expansionistic, due to the fact that it inspired and directed a political movement present in every corner of the world. Which of the different political centers was the most relentless? Sometimes one has the impression of witnessing a game of catch up, Immediately after the Pact of Non-Aggression between the Third Reich and the Soviet Union, Trotsky launched a sort of triumphal cry. It is now evident, even to the Kremlin professional apologists and Stalin's pro-Soviet simpletons of every stripe, those who had deluded themselves that they could count on Moscow's support to contain Nazi Germany's expansionism. It was Neville Chamberlain who was particularly targeted. Yes, the British Prime Minister, already at this time being accused by Churchill for the policy of appeasement pursued relative to Hitler, was bitterly criticized by Trotsky for having harbored illusions about Stalin. Despite all his dislike of the Soviet regime, the British conservative leader had tried with all his might to gain an alliance with Stalin. The colossal proof of naivete. He, Trotsky, since the advent of the Third Reich, had repeatedly made it clear that, in spite of all the talk about the anti-fascist popular fronts, the fundamental aims of Stalin foreign policy was to reach an agreement with Hitler. Now everyone was forced to take note that the Kremlin dictator was Hitler's butler. I think we're starting to see maybe where the dual monster Hitler and Stalin myth maybe is coming from, yeah? I think it starts with a T and ends with a ski. Put in serious difficulties by the Soviet Union's epic resistance against the Third Reich, this game of brinkmanship resumed with force after the 20th CPSU Congress and the secret speech. Khrushchev accused Stalin of having deviated from Lenin. In reality, as Orlov immediately raised the tone by publishing in Life an article that already in its title announced a sensational secret. The Soviet Union had been run for 3 decades by an agent of the Tsarist secret police, obviously ready to do anything to liquidate the wretches who had become aware of his unmentionable past. A Russian scholar, Rogowin, an ardent follower of Trotsky, still seems to adhere to this revelation. The brinkmanship game can take the most peculiar forms. In 1965, Jucher reflected on the evolution of the Menshevik leader Dan, who, dazzled patriotically by the image of a Russia emerging triumphantly from Armageddon, with the Third Reich prostrate at its feet, had ended up recognizing the historical reasons of the October Revolution, but also, unfortunately, of Stalinism with all its ideological provocation and violence. There is only one mitigating factor for this indulgence for a degenerate and depraved Bolshevism. The fact is that, quote, when Dan was writing some of these pages, the wartime tide of pro-Stalinism ran high in Allied countries, especially in the United States. Unquote. Fortunately, the information coming precisely from the capital of the Soviet Union and from within the Communist Party of that country was enough to refute and ridicule once and for all the naive and uninformed who had somehow taken the bait of Moscow's propaganda. Only by virtue of this convergence of differing interests can one explain the paradox of historiography that, while it did not tire of denouncing the farcical nature of the trials held by Stalin in Moscow, calmly took as gold the trial on Stalin, carried out in different ways and for different objectives, first by Trotsky and then by Khrushchev. Chat, let's get a fuck you, Khrushchev, please. I need that to continue. The ups and downs of the image of Stalin. So widespread is the caricature of the huge, grim, whimsical, morbid human monster in our times that the contradictory history that preceded the establishment of such an image has been forgotten. We have seen the accolades paid to Stalin in his time by distinguished statesmen, diplomats, and intellectuals. Even the pages of his 30 years of rule, now considered simply monstrous, were read quite differently in the past. In our day, it is commonplace to identify the revolution from above that radically changed the face of agriculture in the Soviet Union as an exclusive product of ideological fury. But in 1944, while highlighting the terrible human costs, de Gasperi also expressed a fundamentally positive judgment on the great economic enterprise of the collectivization of the countryside and industrialization, made necessary by the danger of war and by the threat revealed by Mein Kampf. In the present day, very few dare to question the thesis that the bloody and large-scale repression Stalin enacted was solely and exclusively a product of his libido dominati, or paranoia. Between the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, Malaparte spoke calmly of the preparations for a coup d'etat in Moscow and of Stalin's hesitation to strike. An authoritative German press organ went further, commenting with irony on the naivete of the Kremlin dictator for not having sent Trotsky and his clique into the great beyond. About 20 years later, it was Churchill himself who indirectly endorsed at least the trials against Tukhachevsky and other military leaders. It had been a merciless, but perhaps not needless military and political purge, which had eliminated its pro-German elements. And, to some extent, even the Moscow trials as such. In the docks at Soviet leaders who were filled with jealousy of Stalin who had ousted them. All the more significant is this stance of the English statesman, champion of the struggle to the bitter end against Hitler's Germany, because it is formulated in the polemic attacking Chamberlain, the protagonist of the policy of appeasement. More radical or more outspoken than Churchill was the American ambassador in the USSR, Joseph Davies, who always insisted that there has been a genuine plot and that trials were fairly conducted and that the Soviet power was stronger as a result. Presumably in this vein, in Italy in 1944, de Gasperi also stressed that the reliability of the accusations against the anti-Stalin opposition was confirmed by objective American information. We know how objective all that American information is. There was then a radical change, but the fragility and inconsistency of the image of Stalin delivered to us first by the Cold War and then by the secret speech began to emerge from the research of a growing number of scholars. In some respects, there is even a resounding reversal. Take the Great Terror. Along with the leading political figures already mentioned, it was a fervent admirer of Trotsky's, that is Ducher, who in 1948 considered the Moscow trials more or less reliable. In his eyes, the Kirov assassination had by no means been a staged assassination by the regime. The long tradition in Tsarist Russia that had attacked autocracy with bombs and revolvers had this and resumed its influence on the young communists. Was not Lenin's brother among the conspirators who attempted to kill Tsar Alexander III? The textbooks surround those martyrs and heroes with a romantic halo, and so the sacred shadows of the past seem now to press bombs and revolvers into the hands of some impatient anti-Stalinist Kamalstri. Ideas of revolutionary terrorism had expanded to become fairly widespread among the young, and had influenced Kirov's murder. Also in 1948, Ducher recognized a certain psychological truth to the Moscow trials in general, and a factual truth regarding the execution of Tukhachevsky in particular. Regarding the latter affair, if certain sources speak of Hitler's intelligence service's machinations, numerous anti-Stalinist versions instead claim that the generals did indeed plan a coup d'etat. In either case, Stalin's paranoia, or libido dominati, had played no role. It should be added that a few years later, without allowing himself to be impressed by the revelations of the secret speech, an American historian, not devoid of sympathies for the anti-Stalinist opposition, which he defined as the conscience of the revolution, wrote, "The selectivity of Bakurin's admissions and what is independently known of the affair make much of the trial evidence plausible, despite the suspicion which the nature of the trials evokes." Unquote. Nowadays, it is the same scholars of Trotskyist orientation who drew attention to the civil war that broke out within the Soviet leadership and claimed the merits of the opposition for having promoted by every means the overthrow of the Thermidorian regime imposed by the traitors of the revolution. It is significant that the shift also involved the camp of the followers of Trotsky, the man who in his time was perhaps more committed than any other to denouncing the Moscow trials as a pure and simple farce. In relation to the leadership of the USSR on the eve of and in the course of the Second World War, Ducher's personal evolution was particularly painful and significant. We are already aware of the very flattering picture he drew in 1948 of Stalin as a wartime leader. In 1956, writing under the immediate impression of the secret speech, Ducher had no difficulty in lending faith to the revelations, according to which, in the days immediately following the unleashing of Operation Barbarossa, Stalin had withdrawn, inert and gloomy and sullen in his dacha, only to return to run the country and to conduct the war by taking a globe and tracing the front line on it. After yielding to the solicitations and entreaties of his collaborators. Ducher's only criticism of Khrushchev and his circle was that they had not followed the recommendation made by Trotsky as early as 1927, namely, of not having felt, quote, the duty of party leaders to overthrow Stalin in order to wage war more efficiently and to a victorious conclusion. "10 years later, returning to this subject, Ducher wrote, quote, nor do I take all of Khrushchev's revelations at their face value. I do not accept in particular his assertion that Stalin's role in the Second World War and the victory over the Third Reich was virtually insignificant." Unquote. It is hardly necessary to say that more recent historical research goes far beyond this partial and timid rethinking. As for the oppression of nations thesis, we already know the radical and positive nobility of the affirmative action implemented in the USSR in favor of national minorities. But now it is worth reading the balance recently traced by another American historian. The new consensus was emerging that, far from being the nation killer familiar from earlier Western nationalist historiographies, the Soviet government undertook an ambitious, complex, and prolonged effort to build ethnically based nations within the context of a politically and economically unitary state, aka a multinational country, state. To aid in this springtime of Soviet nations, the Soviet state gave the former empire's peoples legal and political equality with Russians. They also gave minority languages a privileged place in these new national territories, even if Soviet ethnographers needed to create an alphabet for local dialects because they never had a written form. These policies of promoting national cultural autonomy even extended to attempts at the linguistic assimilation of Russians. Soviet officials and managers were obliged to learn the languages of the nations where they worked. Unquote. A French scholar on Central Asia, Oliver Roy, warmly quoted an essay published in the New York Review of Books, comes to the same conclusions, summarizing the current prospects of that era. Solid, well-functioning states will be able to assert themselves if they treasure the Soviet legacy in an intelligent way. The Muscovite creators of the national policy codified languages, sometimes creating new alphabets for them, edified national parliaments, national libraries, and institute policies of affirmative action in favor of local cadre. Standing out among the protagonists of this enlightened policy was first and foremost Stalin. How far we are from the thesis formulated by Arden during the Cold War, according to which Stalin deliberately disorganized and disarticulated the nationalities in order to create conditions favorable for the triumph of totalitarianism. In the recognition given to the Soviet Union and to Stalin for the nationalities policy, an author at the time, leader of the anti-Soviet dissidents, expressed himself in decidedly emphatic terms. And the decades of Soviet power, for the solution of the national question, the positive elements have been so many that it is difficult to find a comparable example in the history of humanity. On the whole, the characterized portrait of Stalin, drawn first by Trotsky and then by Khrushchev, no longer enjoys much credit. From the research of eminent scholars unsuspected of any indulgence in the cult of personality, emerges in the present day a portrait of a politician who rose and established himself at the USSR summit, primarily because of the fact that, in terms of understanding the workings of the Soviet system, he far surpasses his fellow fighters. Of a leader with exceptional political talent, and one who is enormously gifted. Of a statesman who saves the Russian nation from the destruction and enslavement to which it is destined by the Third Reich, thanks not only to his shrewd military strategy, but also to his masterly war speeches, at times veritable pieces of bravura, which in tragic and decisive moments succeed in stimulated national resistance. Of a personality not without qualities on the theoretical plane either, as demonstrated among other things by the precipitarity with which he treats the national question in his 1913 paper and the positive effect of his contribution on linguistics. Of course, it is stressed at the same time, and with good reason, that this recognition is not an absolving moral judgment, and yet, it now becomes clear that the secret speech is entirely unreliable. There is no detail in it that is not contested today. Take the account of Stalin's alleged psychological collapse in the days immediately following the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. According to the analysis already seen by two Russian historians, certainly of anti-Stalinist orientation, this was an episode that was a complete fabrication, and that, as a French historian reinforces, is in complete contradiction with the evidence and documents that have gradually emerged. But it is not only an episode, however significant it may be. Even with regard to the so-called doctor's plot, Khrushchev cruelly and deliberately distorted the facts. Yes, he took not a few liberties with the truth. The observation, made this time by the English historian often quoted here, about the Stalin's wartime leadership is valuable in general. To show the truth, it is necessary to look beyond both Western Cold War polemics and the contingencies of de-Stalinization in the USSR. Contradictory motives behind Stalin's demonization. For a long time in the West, Arden's thesis has had unchallenged dominance and has been uncritically repeated, which thus demonstrates the irresistible attraction that, in spite of everything, is established between communist totalitarianism and Nazi totalitarianism. The only man for whom Hitler had unqualified respect was Stalin the genius. On the other hand, we know since Khrushchev's speech before the 20th Party Congress that Stalin trusted only one man, and that was Hitler. So much so that, despite all the warnings to the very end, Stalin refused to believe that Hitler would violate the treaty. To confirm this, Arden again cites the secret speech, or more precisely, the text of Khrushchev's speech released by the US State Department. To this assertion, which rests on an immediately political argument and is certainly not afflicted by any concern for historical rigor, could be contrasted the well-documented analysis according to which in post-World War II Hungary and Eastern Europe, Stalin only trusted Jewish cadre, who were in fact called upon to form the backbone of the new state apparatus. As can be seen, the antithesis with respect to Hitler could not be sharper. But let us again dwell on the fragility of the ideological motive dear to Arden and to the dominant ideology. In recent times, there has been a reversal of positions. For some years now, authoritative scholars and indefatigable anti-communist ideologues have insisted on portraying Stalin as an insatiable expansionist, ready to strike at the opportune moment against the very Germany with which he was bound by a non-aggression pact. In this connection, they cite in particular Stalin's speech to the military academy graduates, of which I quote here for reasons of brevity, only the summary contained in Dmitrov's diary. Quote, "Our policy of peace and security is at the same time a policy of preparation for war. There is no defense without offense. The army must be trained in the spirit of offensive action." Unquote. It was on May 5th, 1941, the very day on which Stalin assembles before him the highest offices of the party in the state, evidently in anticipation of the head-on clash with the Third Reich. The impressive development of Soviet armaments had been promoted by Stalin in anticipation of an offensive war, from which Hitler sought to take cover. This thesis, nowadays incessantly stirred up by historical revisionism, can easily be refuted by an author who is also one of the most leading exponents of this historiographical and ideological current. A Malakia diary, as they say in Greece. At the beginning of May 1941, General Anastasiu, who had recently assumed power in Romania, informed his German allies that factories around Moscow had been ordered to transfer their equipment into the country's interior. Conversely, the Nazis were frantically searching for a casus belli. The chief of espionage, Admiral Carneris, wrote in his diary, quote, "General Jodl disclosed to me that they are greatly worried about the Russian soft and indulgent attitude toward us." And he added, half in jest, "If these chaps," meaning the Soviet Russians, "keep on being so accommodating and take offense at nothing, then you will have to stage an incident to start the war." Unquote. The old fascist Strategy of the false flag, huh? The US, as we know, loves to carry on that tradition today. Meanwhile, dislodging revisionist historians from their new warhorse, these testimonies make it unmistakably clear that who the aggressor is. Secondly, they clarify that what unnerved the Third Reich was precisely the attitude Khrushchev reproached Stalin with. The fact remains that the new accusations against Stalin immediately found consecration in the mass media, which, in order to collaborate them further, did not hesitate to exhume the speech of August 19, 1939, commented with knowing indignation by a distinguished Slavic studies expert. Thus, while preparing to send the loyal Molotov to Berlin to conclude the non-aggression pact, Stalin had already worked out, with repugnant cynicism, a plan for the aggression and Sovietization at the appropriate time of the whole of Europe, including Germany. In fact, this is a gross historical fallacy. But this is not the most important point. The revelation of Stalin's new infamy could have been the occasion to discuss again the thesis developed by Ardent, thanks also to the Khrushchev report, of the tenacious relationship between the two highest incarnations of totalitarianism. And yet, none of this. Fuck the demagogues, I say. Historians of the concentrationary universe rightly denounce the further crackdowns experienced in the Gulag and the super exploitation of the prisoners, which reached its horrible peak after the dizzying growth of economic plans in 1940-1941, therefore in the months of the Non-Aggression Pact, when the Soviet leadership, in anticipation of the war, had trampled all other considerations in order to accelerate to the maximum the realization of plans of great strategic and economic importance, such as the construction of airports, airplane factories, and industrial essentials for the war effort. In light of this ever more grotesque indictment, there is a commonplace endorsement by Ardent that nevertheless continues to be obsessively hammered home. It still needs to be shown that Stalin trusted Hitler blindly. The dominant ideology, therefore, easily asserts the most contradictory allegations and accusations. The important thing is that they be defamatory. The tendency is clear of slippage from history to political mythology. The need for demonization, however motivated, manifests itself in other fields as well. The black legend of Stalin's anti-Semitism is uncontested these days. But there is no lack of diametrically opposed views. Here is the research of a journalist, American and Jewish, reporting on Stalin's fondness for Jews, to whom he entrusted the management of concentration camps from which imprisoned Germans were destined to be expelled from Poland. And so, those who had escaped from the final solution could take terrible revenge and become the executioners of their executioners. All thanks to the cunning and perfidy of the Soviet dictator. The latter is accused in a book written by an author close to German Federal Republic military circles of having circulated war propaganda about the gas chambers and a plan for the total extermination of Jewish population by the Third Reich, in order to discredit his enemies. The contrast with the vision of an anti-Semitic Stalin is evident and total, and nevertheless continues to enjoy great popularity. It is also worth noting how the theme of Stalin's paranoia is often asserted in contradictory ways, standing out in a self-assurance with which he diagnoses this illness, is a historian who, at the same time, emphasizes the role Beria is said to have played in the death of the Soviet leader. Of course, one could say that Beria was the victim of the climate he himself had created. The fact remains, however, that at least from a certain moment on, the danger was something real and not the product of morbid fantasy. Or those who accuse Stalin of paranoia are sometimes personalities and authors who, without adducing any evidence, brand him as responsible for the death of his close collaborators, such as Kirov and Zhdanov. Is this not the same attitude reproached against the dictator being used here? However, these questions and problems do not even come up. The important thing is to reiterate the infamy of the communist Oriental despot. Political struggle and the mythology between the French Revolution and October Revolution. In June 1956, under the immediate impression of reading the Khrushchev report, Ducher observed communists had lain prostrate for over a quarter of a century. Unquote. Before a monstrous tyrant who is both morally and intellectually repugnant. Well, how could this have happened? Continuing along this line, he could have added, what had induced illustrious Western philosophers and statesmen to pay this monster declarations of esteem and respect, and in some cases even admiration? These are legitimate and even inescapable questions. Perhaps they should be complemented by another. How could it have happened that Ducher himself had allowed himself to be infected by that disposition, which he so bitterly denounced in 1956? Yes, after the end of the Second World War, and on the occasion of Stalin's death, he had paid tribute to the statesman, who had contributed decisively to the defeat of the Third Reich and had built socialism in the USSR. At that time, the monster of abjection and imbecility had not yet appeared on the scene. And so the question had not yet arisen as to the enormous credit he had long enjoyed, despite everything. But perhaps in 1956, reading the Khrushchev report, Ducher would have been better to ask himself quite a different question. Led by a generalissimo and such a laughable political leader, how could the Soviet Union have managed to defeat the terrible Nazi war machine that had rapidly subjugated the rest of continental Europe? And how could the Soviet Union, starting from a position of extreme weakness, have managed to become a military and industrial superpower? Yes, on a closer look, half a century after the death of Stalin and the sensational de-Stalinization, it is appropriate to take up the question again, as formulated by Ducher, in order to invert it radically. How could such a grotesque and caricatured portrait as the one drawn by Khrushchev rise to the dignity of the historiographical and political dogma? On the contrary, this dogma was gradually enriched with new, more and more fanciful details, beginning with the revelations of the secret speech, which attribute to Stalin a blind confidence in Hitler's compliance with the Non-Aggression Pact. Arden, in subsequent editions of The Origins of Totalitarianism, constructed a theorem of elective affinities between the two dictators. And this is the theorem gradually identified new points of contact and new symmetries, until the two monsters became perfectly equivalent in every aspect of their political action and ideology, including the consummation of a Holocaust and anti-Semitic hatred. The key to explaining this singular phenomenon can be traced to the history of political mythologies. After Thermidor, the Jacobins are consigned to the guillotine on the moral level as well. They became the sultans, the satyrs, who everywhere had set up pleasure places and sites of orgies, in which they abandoned themselves to every excess. Together with and beyond sexual lust, it was, above all, the libido dominati that had devoured Robespierre as he prepared to marry Carpet's daughter, so that he could ascend the throne of France. The accusation was undoubtedly sensational, but the evidence was not lacking. Indeed, it abounded. The marriage contract had already been ready. On the other hand, in the house of the tyrant who had just been executed, the fleur de lis seal of France, who had been found, that is, the seal of the Bourbon dynasty, the execution, or rather the assassination, of Louis XV, then appeared in a new light. The person responsible for this act was perhaps only trying to get rid of a rival. He wanted to sweep away the obstacle that had been preventing him from ascending the throne. Robespierre's moral decapitation was intertwined with a more proper intellectual decapitation. During the Jacobin period, there had been instances of vandalism from below and revolutionary iconoclasm, not promoted from above, which had affected the symbols of the ancient regime. These cases had continued to manifest themselves during Thermidor, this time targeting everything reminiscent of the Terror. But here is how the new rulers put the Jacobins on trial. Out of hatred for the culture they were totally lacking, they had planned to burn down the libraries. Indeed, they had already put this mad project into action. Through various passages, the indictment expanded more and more and became a fact all the more incontrovertible. The more it lost all contact with reality. Boissy d'Anglas could thus expose the Jacobins to public ridicule. Quote, "Doubtless, these wild enemies of humanity only consented to their crimes. Illumination for a moment by means of the light of burning libraries, because they hoped that the shadows of ignorance would only become thicker. The barbarians! They have made the human spirit regress by several centuries." Unquote. The Jacobins had introduced compulsory schooling, and against them, and against the French Revolution as such, counter-revolutionary publicity never tired of denouncing the hubris of reason and celebrating, on the contrary, the beneficial function of prejudice. But in the Thermidor's ideological and political climate, Robespierre and his collaborators were accused of having wanted to spread darkness of ignorance. And the new accusation was launched without any effort to rethink the previous one. Logical consistency was the last of their concerns. With regard to the number of victims of the terror, there was also a process analogous to that already seen about the libraries. Let us give the floor again to the eminent scholar we have been following here. Quote, "There is no skimping on the figures. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, some even speak of millions. It is in short a genocide, as denounced by the Jeunesse Dorée, Golden Youth, which in its counter Marseillaise thundered against the drinkers of human blood, these cannibal hordes, these frightful cannibals. It was an accusation taken up and radicalized on the left. Immediately after Thermidor, Babeuf spoke of a depopulation system put in place in the Vendée by Robespierre, who even pursued, quote, a vile and unprecedented political goal to weed out the human race, unquote. There was thus a convergence between the right and the extreme left of the political spectrum, both agreeing in drawing a portrait of Robespierre as a genocidal monster. However, this paradox was short-lived. Babeuf was quick to grasp the real meaning of Thermidor. Before the judges, who were about to condemn him to death, in denouncing the desperate situation to which the popular masses were now condemned, on the one hand, he referred to Saint-Just and his idea of happiness and escape from poverty for all. And on the other hand, he expressed his disdain for the system of hunger put in place by the new rulers and branded as genocidal by Thermidor and Boissy d'Angles. The accusation of genocide is thus radically reversed. It no longer strikes Robespierre, but his victorious enemies. It would be interesting to make a comparative analysis of the mythologies that have emerged since the Great Revolutions. After October 1917, the Jacobin drinkers of human blood were succeeded by the Bolsheviks, who, as refugees from Soviet Russia reported in the US, had invented and frantically employed an electric guillotine capable of killing 500 men an hour. Damn. That's one hell of a guillotine. We have seen Jacobins branded as frequenters of pleasure places. We have seen Jacobins branded as frequenters of pleasure palaces and organizers of orgies. In the autumn of 1919, the Hungarian communist leader, Belakan, is accused of having set up a splendidly supplied harem, where he, the preserved and insatiable Jew, could rape and defile honorable Christian virgins by the dozen, unquote. Calling attention to this infamy is a newspaper which was later to become the organ of the Nazi Party, but which at this time, in expressing its horror at developments in Eastern Europe, shared a widely held orientation in Western public opinion on both sides of the Atlantic. In America, too, the Bolsheviks are synonymous with debauchery and moral depravity. In Russia, they introduced the nationalization of women, as documents published with the authorization of President Wilson reveal, and as an authoritative newspaper such as the New York Times makes clear in rich detail. Yes, every girl who had reached the age of 18 was forced to register with an Office of Free Love, which then assigned the unfortunate woman to an arbitrarily chosen man, and she was forced to suffer the government's impositions in her body and soul. If the Jacobins were barbarians, all the more so were the protagonists of the October Revolution branded first as agents of Imperial Germany, i.e. of the Huns and the Vandals of the Germans were defined by the Andante propaganda during the First World War, and later as agents of the international Jewry. Doubly alien to authentic civilization, both because of its geographical origin and because of its contribution to the revolt of colonies and of colored peoples, as Nazi propaganda never tired of repeating. Finally, if for some time Robespierre was accused by Babeuf of wishing to exterminate the human race as a whole, Conquest is content to attribute to Stalin the planned starvation to death of the Ukrainian people. The themes sketched here constitute only modest suggestions for the future historian. Pending the desirable comparisons of political mythologies, however, It is worth noting that Stalin suffered a worse fate than Robespierre. Yes, in modern day Russia, there is no shortage of popular demonstrations raising Stalin's portrait. And the majority of adults are positive about Stalin and see in him the tough leader the country needed in such calamitous times. Among the former dissidents, we see Alexander Zhivnov, branding Yeltsin as the leader of a criminal counter-revolution and a colonial democracy, and drawing up an astonishing balance sheet of the history of the Soviet Union as a whole, including the 3 decades of the Stalin era. Quote, thanks to communism, Russia was able to avoid even worse evils and achieve, in extremely difficult historical conditions, progress that only a cynical rogue can deny. Unquote. In the West, on the other hand, even on the left, the accusations of Stalinism is ready to strike anyone who dares to advance some doubts or formulate some questions. If anything, it is in the bourgeois camp that some timid signs of rethinking can be glimpsed. Already a few months after the collapse of the Soviet Union, an authoritative Italian newspaper reported, quote, 1.5 million people are in danger of not surviving winter because of the immediate lack of food and medicine throughout the USSR, as stated in a report by the International Red Cross. Sometime later, again analyzing Yeltsin's Russia, a distinguished political scientist, Maurice de Verger, pointed out the collapse in average life expectancy, the responsibility for which fell on the privileged few who had succeeded in accumulating enormous wealth through parasitical speculation, if not openly illegal, and denounced the veritable genocide of the elderly. If not reversal, the accusation of genocide still gets applied across the board, with the condemnation of a hero of the West, Yeltsin, and with him of the West as such, considered responsible for a tragedy taking place not during a situation of acute political and economic crisis, but after the disappearance of the Cold War itself, and a period in which, at least in the most advanced countries, shortages are only a remote memory. Edgar Quintet's assessment of the French Revolution comes to mind. The Terror had been the first calamity. The second, which destroyed the Republic, was the trial of the Terror. Unquote. And there you have Chapter 7, Stalin History and Critique of a Black Legend. Next Thursday, we will read the next part, Chapter 8, Demonization and Hagiography, in the interpretation of the contemporary world. From the omission of Russia's second time of troubles to the omission of China's century of humiliation. Which is, coincidentally, also the last chapter before we get to the foreword. There we go, comrades. Another one down. Hell yeah! W read, L read. And now I'm looking here and I'm seeing down below that we indeed have sub candy filled up. Thank you, comrades. Thank you for the W's. I'm glad you all enjoyed it. Wow! 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 It's a Mew Me's. We're the winds of history blowing that fucking gravesite clean, Dimitros. Yeah, if you like this read, consider liking, consider subscribing to the channel, and maybe come check me out here on Kick. I'm streaming live every single day.